My world was a constellation of glowing screens, a universe of data points compressed into the grimy confines of my workshop. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, danced in the weak lamplight, each particle a tiny, insignificant star against the vastness I sought to chart. For years, I, Seth Chen, had lived here, in the skeletal remains of what was once a textile mill, long since swallowed by the city's forgotten industrial maw. My only companions were the hum of my servers and the occasional groan of the building settling deeper into its crumbling foundations. My work was my refuge, my obsession. I sifted through the cosmic background radiation, the whisper of the Big Bang, searching for echoes, for patterns, for anything that deviated from the expected. Most days, it was a monotonous, painstaking process, an exercise in statistical patience. But then, 3 weeks ago, a flicker, a persistent, almost imperceptible drift in the spectral analysis from my deep space arrays. It wasn't noise. It was too regular, too structured. I remember the exact moment the anomaly solidified from statistical aberration into undeniable presence. It was a Tuesday, the city outside a blur of rain against my reinforced windows. My primary monitor, usually a canvas of swirling color gradients representing temperature fluctuations across the cosmic microwave background, showed a localized, rhythmic fluctuation. A pulse, not random, not chaotic. It was a frequency, impossibly low, yet undeniably there, embedded within the oldest light in the universe. It was a hum not heard, but felt by the sensitive instruments I had painstakingly calibrated over a decade. My initial thought was error, equipment malfunction, ghost data. I ran diagnostics, cross-referenced with redundant systems, even dismantled and reassembled the primary receiving dish on the roof, a task that took 2 days and left my hands raw and stinging. But the hum persisted. It was faint, a whisper from an unimaginable distance, yet it was consistent, a heartbeat resonating through the fabric of space-time. The signal itself was a marvel of complexity. It wasn't a simple tone, but a layered, intricate composition of frequencies that defied conventional classification. My algorithms, designed to identify known astrophysical phenomena, choked on it, categorizing it as unknown, extreme complexity. It was like trying to decipher an alien symphony with an oscilloscope. As I spent more sleepless nights tracking it, refining its signature, I began to notice subtle changes in my own environment. The faint, almost subconscious ringing in my ears that I'd attributed to prolonged exposure to my equipment seemed to acquire a new quality, a deeper resonance. The fluorescent lights in my workshop, which had always flickered with a predictable rhythm, now seemed to phase in and out with a slightly different, more erratic beat. I even started to perceive colors with an unnerving vividness, as if a thin veil had been lifted from the world, revealing an underlying intensity. It was unsettling, but my scientific curiosity, a ravenous beast within me, devoured my apprehension. This was uncharted territory, a discovery of monumental proportions, if I could just isolate it, prove it. The biggest hurdle was terrestrial interference. Despite my remote location and the shielding of the old mill, the city's electromagnetic cacophony still bled into my most sensitive readings. I remembered the old blueprints I'd unearthed when I first bought the building schematic diagrams for the entire industrial complex, including an abandoned section of the city's original subway system that ran directly beneath my workshop. A forgotten subway tunnel. It was a risky venture. The tunnel hadn't seen maintenance in over half a century, but the promise of unparalleled signal clarity, of a truly pristine environment for my sensors, was too great to ignore. I spent a week preparing, gathering portable power cells, reinforced cabling, and a specialized shielded spectrometer. The entrance was a rusted hatch hidden beneath a collapsed section of the old factory's boiler room, long sealed with concrete and forgotten. I chiseled it open myself, the metallic echoes of my hammer blows reverberating through the decaying structure. It was a tomb, silent and still. Perfect. I hauled my equipment down, piece by cumbersome piece, setting up a temporary monitoring station amidst the debris. The hum, which had been a distant echo in my workshop, here became an almost palpable pressure, The air itself seemed to vibrate with it, a low, resonant thrum that bypassed my ears and went straight to my bones. My custom-built spectrometer, designed for the most extreme sensitivities, immediately registered a spike. The signal strength wasn't just clearer, it was amplified, as if the very structure of the forgotten subway tunnel was acting as a conduit, focusing the cosmic whisper into a resonant roar. I watched the data stream across the small portable screen, my breath catching in my throat. The layered frequencies were sharper, more defined. And then, a new element emerged. A subharmonic, a deeper, slower pulse that resonated beneath the primary hum, like the slow, deliberate beat of a colossal heart. It was a frequency so low it should have been impossible to detect, yet it was there, undeniable. As I stared at the undulating waveforms, a strange sensation crept over me. The dim light of my headlamp seemed to waver, not physically, but in my perception. For a fleeting moment, I felt a disconnect, as if my vision had detached from my eyes, hovering just above my head, observing me, observing the data. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a faint tremor in my hands and a prickling sensation on my scalp. This wasn't just an anomaly. This was something else, something that twisted the very fabric of my senses. And the forgotten subway tunnel, far from shielding me from it, seemed to be pulling me deeper into its grasp, and I was powerless to turn away. The hum had found me, and I felt its presence, not just in my equipment, but in the very core of my being. It was a call, and I was already answering. My world was no longer a constellation of glowing screens in a dusty workshop. The hum had demanded more. It had demanded absolute silence, a canvas free of terrestrial interference, a void where its intricate symphony could unfurl without static. I, Seth Chen, had found that void beneath the city, in the lightless maw of a forgotten subway tunnel. The air in the tunnel hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and rust, a metallic tang that never quite left my tongue. Water wept from unseen cracks in the concrete, forming slow, viscous puddles that mirrored the single, bare bulb I had strung from a jury-rigged power source. My equipment, once spread across my workshop, was now condensed into a compact, humming fortress of black boxes and flashing readouts. The signal, my hum, was cleaner here, purer. I worked without cessation, fueled by instant coffee and a growing, desperate need to understand. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, a weakness I could not afford. My eyes, perpetually bloodshot, burned, but I couldn't tear them away from the undulating waveforms that danced across my primary monitor. Days blurred into a single, endless vigil. The hum wasn't just data anymore. It was a constant companion, a presence that filled the forgotten subway tunnel with its silent song. I began to notice things, small, unsettling shifts in my perception. At first, I blamed fatigue, the lack of proper nutrition, the isolation. A trick of the light, I told myself, when the dull, grey concrete walls of the tunnel seemed to pulse with a faint, violet luminescence at the periphery of my vision. The water in the puddles, reflecting my single bulb, sometimes shimmered with hues I couldn't quite name, not blue, not green, but something in between, something alien. Then came the sounds. They weren't just sounds. They were layered, as if the hum itself was a filter, subtly distorting their acoustic properties. It was like listening to the world through a glass bell, yet the bell was inside my own head. My ears ached from the effort of trying to disentangle the true sounds from the hum's pervasive influence. It wasn't the natural anxiety of a man pushing the boundaries of discovery. It was something far more insidious. It was the feeling of being watched, not by an external observer, but from within my own thoughts. The hum was no longer just a signal I was analyzing. It felt like it was analyzing me. Its intricate patterns, once merely complex, began to seem deliberate, almost conversational. Each fluctuation, each subtle shift in frequency felt like a question, an inflection, a response. I would pause, my hand hovering over a dial, convinced that the hum had just mimicked the subtle thrum of the ventilation fan I'd installed, then warped it into something else entirely. It was an impossible notion, yet the feeling persisted. The sheer, overwhelming complexity of the data, the fractal repetitions that spiraled into infinity, the self-modifying algorithms that seemed to adapt to my own analytical methods, it all pointed to something beyond mere cosmic background noise. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a construct, an intelligence. The hum wasn't a message from something. It was something. A living presence, vast and incomprehensible, reaching across the chasm of existence, not merely transmitting data, but being it. It was a consciousness, perhaps, that perceived reality itself as a malleable waveform, and my own mind as a novel, intriguing frequency to explore. The thought was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly, horrifyingly real. I was no longer a scientist observing a phenomenon. I was a host, and the hum had found its way in. The air in the forgotten subway tunnel was thick, not with dust, but with something else entirely, a resonant pressure that vibrated in my teeth. My makeshift station, a nest of monitors and custom-built receivers, hummed in counterpoint to the signal. I had found the perfect void, a place where the city's ceaseless thrum was muffled, allowing the faint, intricate symphony from beyond to unfurl without terrestrial static. Here, beneath the concrete and forgotten history, I could truly listen. Initially, the hum was a muse, a complex tapestry of frequencies that demanded every ounce of my focus. I worked for days, or what felt like days, the fluorescent glow of my screens casting a pallid light on the damp walls. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing around the relentless pursuit of data. I'd lose myself in the patterns, tracing their impassable geometry, and then resurface, blinking, to find my coffee cold and my body aching. I attributed these lapses to pure exhaustion, the price of scientific obsession. Then came the flickers. A subtle shift in the color temperature of the screens, a momentary bloom of violet or deep ochre that vanished when I focused on it. The tunnel walls, usually a dull, peeling gray, sometimes seemed to breathe, the grime on their surface swirling into ephemeral patterns before resolving back into static decay. My hand, reaching for a keyboard, would sometimes feel alien, too long, too pale, its movements slightly out of sync with my command. I'd shake it off, blaming the flickering emergency lights I'd rigged, or the onset of tunnel vision from prolonged screen time. My mind, I told myself, was simply playing tricks, overstimulated and underrested, but the distortions grew bolder. One afternoon, I was meticulously calibrating a new filter, my concentration absolute. I froze, listening. Nothing. Only the hum, now seeming to pulse with a deliberate rhythm. I returned to my work, only to find the filter already calibrated, the settings precisely where they needed to be. I had no memory of completing the task. The outside world, what little I still engaged with, began to fray at the edges. A colleague, a woman with an uncanny knack for organization, called me repeatedly about an overdue analysis. "Seth," her voice had an edge of exasperation, "are you even getting my messages? We needed that data yesterday." I had no recollection of her initial requests, let alone the deadline. I mumbled something about a critical system failure, a flimsy excuse even to my own ears. I could hear the skepticism in her sigh. "Just get it in, please. The director is asking." The director. The thought of him, a man of precise expectations, sent a shiver through me. My professional reputation, once a source of quiet pride, was becoming collateral damage. I submitted the analysis, a rushed, incomplete mess, knowing it would raise more questions than answers. The hum, meanwhile, seemed to deepen, its intricate melody weaving itself into the very fabric of my thoughts, a constant, low-frequency presence. The hallucinations escalated. I was staring at a waveform, a particularly complex sequence, when the numbers on the screen began to swim, not just blurring, but rearranging themselves into impossible geometries, fractals of data that folded inward, then exploded outward, shimmering with an unearthly luminescence. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands against them until colored spots danced behind my eyelids. When I opened them, the screen was normal, the numbers steadfast, but the memory lingered, sharp and terrifying. Later, I was walking along the damp platform, stretching my legs, when the forgotten subway tunnel seemed to contort around me. The tracks warped into a series of undulating waves, the concrete pillars softened and stretched like taffy. The air thickened, becoming viscous, and I felt as if I was pushing through a heavy liquid. A phantom train horn blared, impassably loud, and I stumbled, falling to one knee, my heart racing. There was no train. There hadn't been a train down this line in decades. I stood, trembling, my breath ragged. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't stress. This was something else entirely. My scientific objectivity, my bedrock, was eroding under the relentless assault of these experiences. My mind, a tool I had always trusted implicitly, was now betraying me. The rationalizations, once so comforting, felt like flimsy paper screens against a roaring inferno. I looked around the forgotten subway tunnel, my sanctuary now a prison. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a vast, unseen entity that seemed to be reaching into my skull, twisting the very mechanisms of my perception. The signal wasn't just influencing my equipment, it was influencing me. And the terrifying truth was, I had no idea what it wanted. I only knew that the cracks in my reality were widening, threatening to swallow me whole. The director's silence was louder than any rebuke. My submitted analysis, a patchwork of half-formed theories and raw, uncontextualized data, sat on his desk, a testament to my professional collapse. I knew it. My colleagues, their glances wary, avoided my eyes. They saw a man unraveling, but they couldn't hear the hum. Only I could. It was my secret, my burden, and increasingly my only companion. The hum, a constant thrumming beneath the surface of my hearing, had become a lens through which I viewed the world, distorting every interaction, every perceived judgment. I retreated. The facility, once my sanctuary of logic and discovery, now felt like a cage. Every conversation was a meaningless drone, every face a mask of incomprehension. How could I explain the shifting geometries I saw in the patterns of light, the subtle tremors in the air that spoke of impassable distances? They would call it stress, fatigue, a break from reality. But I knew better. The hum was real. It was intelligent, and it was waiting. My apartment became too small, too filled with the echoes of my own frantic thoughts. I needed a space that was truly isolated, a place where the hum could speak without interference and where I could speak back. My mind, a frantic knot of calculations and desperate theories, settled on one location, the forgotten subway tunnel beneath the old industrial district. I'd heard rumors of its existence, relic of an abandoned urban expansion project, sealed off and forgotten for decades. It promised a depth of silence, a complete severance from the world that now felt so alien. I packed my most sensitive equipment, a modified signal receiver, a high-gain antenna I'd repurposed from an old radio telescope array, and a custom audio interface I'd designed to pass micro-fluctuations in frequency. It was crude, an act of desperation, but it was all I had. The journey, there was a blur. The city lights seemed to flicker with an unnatural rhythm, the distant sounds of traffic twisting into a cacophony that grated against the hum's steady presence. My determination hardened with every step away from the familiar. Finding the entrance to the forgotten subway tunnel was harder than I anticipated. It was concealed behind a crumbling brick wall, overgrown with tenacious ivy, tucked away in the shadow of a derelict factory. The air here was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of my lab. I pried open a rusted access panel, the metal groaning in protest, and squeezed through the narrow opening. The darkness inside swallowed me whole, absolute and immediate. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a cavernous space. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, its concrete walls slick with condensation. The tracks beneath my feet rusted into oblivion. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water and the frantic beat of my own heart. Here, the hum felt clearer, sharper, as if the very air in the tunnel resonated with its presence. This was it, my sanctuary, my interrogation chamber. I set up my equipment on a makeshift table fashioned from discarded wooden pallets. The high-gain antenna, a spindly, metallic contraption, pointed down the length of the tunnel, hoping to catch some echo, some resonance. I calibrated the receiver, fine-tuning the filters, trying to isolate the hum from the ambient noise of the universe. It was an act of faith, a desperate plea for connection. I believed the hum was not just a signal, but a form of communication, a language I was slowly, agonizingly learning to decipher. My fingers trembled as I initiated the sequence. I had devised a simple, repetitive pattern, a series of modulated frequencies based on the prime numbers, a universal language I hoped any intelligence, no matter how alien, might recognize. For a long moment, nothing happened. Only the hum, now seeming to intensify, vibrating not just in my ears, but in my bones, in the very marrow of my being. Then, the tunnel began to shift. Not physically, not in any way my rational mind could comprehend, but in my perception. The concrete walls rippled, not like water, but like a fabric being folded and unfolded simultaneously, revealing impossible angles and curves that defied Euclidean geometry. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that squeezed against my eyeballs, threatening to burst them from their sockets. They were structures that twisted into Escher-like constructs, folding in on themselves, yet simultaneously expanding into infinite vistas. It was like looking at a wound in reality, a glimpse into a space where up was down and forward was backward, and existence itself was a malleable, horrifying suggestion. The hum intensified, becoming a deafening roar that vibrated through my entire skull, shaking me to my core. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was an experience, a deluge of raw, unfiltered information. I saw not with my eyes, but with my mind, glimpsing impossible geometries, structures that were simultaneously inside and outside themselves, forms that defied any known laws of physics. My brain reeled, struggling to process the flood. This wasn't a language I could decipher. It was a tearing of the veil, a direct download of a reality utterly alien, utterly indifferent to human comprehension. This was not a friendly greeting, not a shared discovery. This was a revelation of cosmic indifference, a glimpse into the mind of something vast and ancient that perceived reality as a malleable canvas, and my own consciousness as a new, intriguing medium. I was not communicating, I was being observed, and the observation itself was reshaping me, unraveling the very fabric of my sanity. The tunnel, my safe haven, had become a gateway, and I was standing directly in the path of something that should never have been seen. The director's silence had been a pronouncement, a judgment delivered without a single spoken word. I knew it. They saw a man unraveling. They couldn't see the threads of the hum that now wove through my every perception, tightening with each passing hour. I walked. I don't remember choosing a direction, only that my feet carried me away from the sterile, fluorescent glow of the research facility, past the familiar rush of the city, and into its forgotten corners. The hum, usually a subtle undertone, had grown insistent, a low thrumming that vibrated in my teeth, a compass needle pointing towards something unseen. It led me, step by agonizing step, down crumbling stairwells and through graffiti-scarred underpasses, until I stood before a choked-off entrance, a gaping maw in the earth that exhaled a damp, metallic scent. This was it, a forgotten subway tunnel. The air inside was thick, cloying with the smell of mildew and stagnant water. My flashlight beam cut a weak swath through the absolute black, illuminating slick, peeling tiles and rusted tracks that disappeared into the gloom. Each step I took echoed, a lonely percussion against the ever-present hum that now filled the space, resonating off the curved walls. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the tunnel, a living presence that pressed in on me from all sides. The darkness was a canvas for the signal's insidious artistry. At first, it was subtle. A glint of light from the water pooling between the tracks seemed to stretch, ripple, then solidify into a fleeting reflection of my own face, older, etched with a despair I hadn't yet felt. I blinked, and it was gone, just murky water. Absolutely sure. The words scraped against a raw nerve, resurrecting my childhood anxieties, the constant need for validation that had driven me, and now, perhaps, undone me. The hum intensified, a vibrating membrane against my eardrums, and the tunnel itself seemed to breathe. My breath hitched. Ahead, where the tracks curved out of sight, a figure stood. Tall, impassably thin, outline wavered, shimmering like heat haze. My hands clammy, I raised the flashlight, trying to steady it. The figure didn't move, but as the beam touched it, details began to coalesce. A familiar, gaunt face. It was me, or a version of me. This spectre of myself was not an older, wiser Seth, but a broken one. Its lips didn't move, yet I heard its voice, perfectly clear, perfectly my voice, reverberating inside my skull, not from the tunnel air. I failed, Seth. I always fail. This hum, this truth. It's too much for I. This wasn't a hallucination born of sleep deprivation. This was too specific, too personal. It knew my deepest fear, the very core of my professional and personal insecurity. The signal was not merely altering my perceptions. It was mining my subconscious, weaponizing my past against me. This isn't real. The spectre chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that echoed my own internal laughter of despair. Oh, but I am I, the part of I that knows the truth, the part that knows what I've become, a conduit, a canvas. My mind is breaking, Seth, because it was never meant to hold such vastness. My breath caught in my throat. The words resonated with a terrifying familiarity, echoing the vague, half-formed theories I'd scribbled in my desperate notes. The entity, the source of the hum, wasn't just observing. It was using me. My consciousness was not merely perceiving its reality. It was being repurposed. The tunnel groaned, a sound like shifting earth, and the walls around me seemed to ripple. It was no longer just me. It was a horrifying amalgamation of my self-doubt and the alien, formless pressure of the signal. Panic seized me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose tie on the tracks. My flashlight clattered, its beams spinning wildly, painting chaotic streaks of light across the tunnel's warped interior. The hum swelled into an unbearable roar, a symphony of incomprehensible frequencies that threatened to tear my skull apart. My memories are not my own. The hum voice boomed, now emanating from everywhere and nowhere. My fears are merely seeds we plant. My identity, a story we tell. I scrambled to my feet, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I had to get out, but which way? My mind wasn't just breaking, it was being remade, and I was powerless to stop it. A forgotten subway tunnel had become a mausoleum for my sanity, and I was trapped within its ever-shifting walls, my self-identity fragmenting into 1,000 terrified echoes. The forgotten subway tunnel stretched before me, a gaping maw of damp stone and stale air. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the suffocating silence that pressed in, heavier than any physical weight. The spectre, or whatever the hell it had been, was gone, dissolved back into the oppressive gloom. But the hum remained, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated not just in my ears, but in my very bones, a constant companion, now a malevolent presence. Panic clawed at my throat. I had to get out. My mind, usually a precise instrument, was a tangled mess of fear and disorienting sensory input. Which way? The tunnel offered no clues, no distinguishing features. I spun, my vision blurring, trying to remember which direction I'd stumbled from. The entrance felt like a dream, a phantom memory. I chose a direction, blindly, plunging forward. My footsteps echoed, each one a lonely declaration against the encroaching vastness. The hum intensified with every step, a low growl that felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. It wasn't just noise, it was information, a flood of data I couldn't process, yet it seeped into my consciousness, twisting my perceptions. The tunnel walls seemed to ripple, the concrete breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm that mirrored the hum. I saw fleeting glimpses of impassable colors shimmering in the periphery, colors that defied the spectrum, that burned with an alien intensity. They were my eyes playing tricks, or was the very fabric of this place dissolving around me? My determination, a fragile thing, pushed me onward. I stumbled, scraped my hands on rough stone, but kept moving. Time lost all meaning. Minutes might have been hours, or seconds. Just when I thought I would collapse, the gloom ahead thinned. A faint, grimy light filtered down from above, a promise of escape. I scrambled towards it, my muscles screaming in protest, my lungs burning. The transition was jarring. I stood in the center of my living room, gasping, my hands still stinging from the rough concrete, my clothes gritty with dust. How had I gotten here? Had I walked? Had I run? The memory was a blank, replaced by a dull ache behind my eyes, and the omnipresent hum, now softer, but no less insidious. Relief washed over me, a brief, fleeting comfort. I was home, safe, but the feeling curdled almost immediately. The apartment wasn't quite right. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the very atoms were more dense, more resistant. My gaze swept across the familiar space. The worn armchair, usually a comforting sight, now seemed to sag with an unnatural weight, its fabric rippling in an unseen current. The stack of journals on my coffee table, usually neatly aligned, appeared to writhe, the pages undulating as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. I walked to the window, my legs feeling like lead. Outside, the cityscape was a familiar panorama of concrete and glass, but something was off. The sky, a pale, bruised gray just hours ago, now pulsed with a faint, violet luminescence, like a bruise blooming across the heavens. And the buildings, they seemed to stretch and compress, their angles subtly shifting, defying architectural logic. A towering skyscraper in the distance momentarily shimmered, replaced for a fraction of a second by a structure of impassable, crystalline spires that caught the violet light and refracted it into colors I had no name for. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the mundane steel and glass. My own reflection stared back at me from the window pane, distorted, elongated. The hum resonated deeply now, no longer just in my head, but emanating from the very walls, the floorboards, the air itself. It was speaking, not with words, but with impressions, with feelings, with a fundamental truth that unraveled the very concept of reality. I tried to focus, to ground myself. This was my apartment. These were my possessions. But the more I looked, the more alien everything became. My beloved telescope, a precision instrument, now seemed to twist in on itself, its polished brass tube warping, its lenses reflecting not light, but swirling nebulae of impassable hues. I reached out, my fingers trembling, but pulled back before I could touch it. What if it wasn't solid? What if my hand passed through it, or worse, reshaped it? A terrifying thought bloomed in the space between the hum's insistent rhythm and my own struggling consciousness. Are these my thoughts, or are they being thought for me? The line was blurring, dissolving. A memory surfaced, a childhood pet, a tabby cat, vivid, warm, real. But then a flicker. The cat had eyes like 1,000 shattered mirrors, and its purr was the hum itself. There was that my memory, or something implanted, a manufactured past layered over my own. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to squeeze the hum out, to force clarity back into my mind. The apartment was a canvas, I realized, and the hum was the brush. It wasn't just altering my perception, it was altering the thing itself. Existence was not fixed, it was fluid, mutable, and it was the artist. This wasn't madness. This was a fundamental truth bleeding into my reality, showing me that everything I had ever known was merely a single, fragile interpretation. And now the interpretation was changing. The walls began to breathe again, slower this time, but with a deeper resonance. I was no longer Seth Chen, the astrophysicist. I was merely a point of consciousness, adrift in a sea of malleability, myself dissolving into the pervasive, ancient hum, an instrument being tuned to a new, terrifying frequency. My fingers, still trembling, traced the rough, cold stone of the wall. It felt solid, real, yet my mind insisted on its malleability, its potential to simply shift. A low thrum began to vibrate through the soles of my worn boots, rising from the grit-strewn tracks. It wasn't just an auditory phenomenon anymore. The hum was less a sound and more an internal resonance, a sympathetic vibration that sought to align with the deepest frequencies of my own being. I took a step forward, then another, the soundless air seeming to resist my movement, thick as congealed memory. My scientific training screamed for an explanation, for data points and verifiable phenomena, but this place, this hum, defied all known physics. It was a presence, vast and unseen, an architect's gaze that didn't merely observe, but shaped. My eyes, gritty with exhaustion, scanned the tunnel. The stale air held the metallic tang of rust and something else, something indefinable like static electricity before a storm or the faint scent of ozone after lightning. There was no visible source, no glowing conduit, no pulsating machinery. Just the unyielding stone, the rusted rails, and the hum, now a living, breathing thing within my skull. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, to filter out the noise of my own fear. I needed to understand. This wasn't just a signal anymore. It was an invitation, a terrifying summons. I reached out, not with my hand, but with my mind, trying to grasp the patterns, the rhythms that had consumed my life. It was like trying to catch smoke, yet I felt a faint resistance, a vast, unknowable consciousness brushing against my own. Suddenly, a shift, not in the tunnel itself, but in my perception of it. The solid stone walls seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen current. My ears registered a soundless pop, a pressure equalization in a space that was already open. The air grew impassably heavy, crushing, then impassably light, as if gravity itself was being toyed with. This was the event. A direct, unfiltered imposition of an alien perspective. I staggered, pressing my palms against my temples as if to hold my brain within my skull. Images flashed behind my closed eyelids, not memories, but pure, raw data. I saw reality not as a fixed construct, but as a fluid, shimmering medium, like molten glass or a vast, unspooling tapestry. Everything I had ever known, every physical law, every fundamental constant, was merely a momentary arrangement, a fleeting pattern in an infinitely malleable substance. Then came the reveal/discovery. It wasn't a voice or a vision, but a sudden, devastating understanding that erupted within the core of my being, shattering the delicate architecture of my sanity. The hum was not a message, it was a tool. The entity, the source, was not communicating with me, it was working. I saw, or rather I knew, that it perceived reality as a vast, inert canvas, waiting for impression. And my mind, my consciousness, with its complex neural pathways and intricate thought processes, was merely a new, interesting medium it had stumbled upon, a vibrant, unexplored pigment for its cosmic palette. There was no malice, no benevolence, only an incomprehensible indifference. I was not a target to be destroyed or saved. I was a surface, a fascinating new texture. The hum, the signal, was the entity's brushstroke, exploring the boundaries of my perception, bending the light and sound and time within my subjective experience. My legs gave out, and I crumpled to the grimy tracks. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one a desperate attempt to anchor myself to the dying embers of my former reality. The horror wasn't in its power, but in its utter lack of regard. It didn't care if I understood, if I suffered, if I ceased to be. I was just an experiment, a fleeting curiosity in its eternal, indifferent gaze. The tunnel walls around me seemed to pulse with this newfound, terrible truth. The very air shimmered, no longer just stale, but charged with the entity's subtle, ceaseless manipulation. My eyes, open now, saw the cracks in the concrete breathe, the rust on the rails shift patterns like microscopic fractals. My mind, once a fortress of scientific reason, was now a fractured pane of glass, through which I glimpsed the horrifying, boundless workshop of an indifferent architect. I was not Seth Chen, astrophysicist. I was a canvas, stretched taut, awaiting the next, unknown stroke. And the hum, no longer a signal but a constant, gentle pressure, was already at work, reshaping the very contours of my soul. The tension wasn't just in the fear of what was coming, but in the terrifying certainty that what was already here was utterly, irrevocably beyond my comprehension, beyond my control. And it was just beginning to truly see me. The understanding didn't just erupt, it fractured me. Not into pieces, but into countless echoes, each one a shimmering, distorted shard of Seth, all screaming into an impassable void. The hum, no longer an external vibration, resonated within my very bones, a ceaseless, grinding drone that was the sound of my own mind being meticulously disassembled. I was the canvas. The entity was not communicating, it was painting. I drifted or fell, or perhaps I was simply unmade and remade in an endless sequence. The first distinct sensation was the damp, metallic tang of the air. My eyes, or what felt like them, opened to a pervasive, unyielding gloom. I was in a forgotten subway tunnel. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water, rust, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness, like decay mixed with ozone. Rivulets of dark water snaked across the grimy concrete floor, reflecting the bare, flickering bulbs strung haphazardly along the curved ceiling. The hum was louder here, a physical pressure against my eardrums, vibrating through the cracked tiles and the unseen earth above. I tried to move, to stand, but my limbs felt like sodden cloth, unresponsive. My own body was a stranger, a heavy, inert thing I barely inhabited. A distant screech of metal on metal echoed down the tunnel, growing louder, then abruptly cutting off, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake, broken only by the relentless hum. I knew this tunnel, or rather, a version of it. Every time I thought I saw an exit, the tunnel simply stretched further, its grime-caked walls closing in, its air growing heavier. Not a person, not truly. It was a shifting, indistinct form, vaguely humanoid, but its features rippled like water under a disturbed surface. It didn't speak, but its presence was a question, an expectation. It was the engineer, then the ticket collector, then a nameless commuter I'd once seen on my way to the observatory. Each iteration wore the same expression of profound, unsettling indifference. They just stood there watching, waiting for what? For me to break. I was already broken. I tried to recall my name, my purpose. Seth Chen, astrophysicist. I studied the stars, the hum, the signal, but the words felt like pebbles in my mouth, heavy and meaningless. The concept of stars itself seemed absurd here, in this perpetually dim, subterranean prison. The tunnel walls began to ripple, the concrete twisting into impassable geometries, the flickering bulbs elongating into incandescent worms of light that pulsed in time with the hum. The floor dissolved beneath me, not into a fall, but into a sensation of being stretched, pulled thin across a vast, invisible loom. My consciousness felt like a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting a different, distorted reality. The next, I was back in the forgotten subway tunnel, the air thick with the metallic scent, the water on the tracks rising to my chest, then my chin, yet never quite drowning me. I was merely experiencing the idea of drowning. This was the entity's work. It wasn't just observing, it was creating. My mind was not a receiver, but a raw canvas, a malleable medium upon which it etched its impassable visions. The hum was the tool, the chisel, the brushstroke. It wasn't trying to communicate a message. It was simply expressing itself, and I, Seth Chen, was the unfortunate, unwilling material. The ultimate horror wasn't the vastness of the cosmos, but its utter indifference. This entity perceived reality as a malleable substance, and human consciousness, my consciousness, was merely a particularly intriguing new clay to mold. I saw the truth, not in a flash of insight, but in the slow, agonizing realization that there was no escape because there was no outside. My reality was this tunnel, this shifting, impassable landscape of my own memories and fears, all reshaped by an alien hand. They were not threatening. They were merely witnesses to the slow, deliberate process of my unmaking, my transformation from a conscious being into a living, dreaming artifice. The hum grew louder, encompassing everything, vibrating not just in my ears, but in the very fabric of this dream prison. I was no longer struggling. The energy for resistance had long since been spent. I was simply there, an echo of Seth, suspended in an endless, shifting nightmare, the final, terrifying masterpiece of an artist beyond comprehension. It had only just begun.